The sound of the surf was the first thing that began to grate on him. Not the soothing rush of the tide, but a relentless, mocking roar. It was the sound of the world reminding him he was utterly, irrevocably alone. Alexander Selkirk stood on the edge of the island, his gaze locked on the empty, infinite blue of the Pacific. It wasn't the sea that had defeated him. It was pride. He had been the sailing master of the privateering ship, the Cinque Ports, in the year 1704. A brilliant sailor, yes, but also hot-headed, abrasive, and dangerously convinced of his own superior judgment. The ship was a disaster. Rotten timber, leaking hull, and a paranoid captain named Thomas Stradling who was leading them all toward a watery grave. Selkirk had argued, he had pleaded, and finally, he had done the unthinkable. He declared the ship unseaworthy. He demanded to be put ashore. He believed his captain would beg him to return, that the other crew would mutiny and follow him. He was Alexander Selkirk, the best navigator they had. He stood on the beach of Masa Tierra, an uninhabited volcanic speck of rock 400 miles off the coast of Chile, watching his supplies being offloaded. A musket, some gunpowder, a few tools, a kettle, a Bible, and enough tobacco to last a month. Captain Stradling watched from the longboat, a thin, triumphant smile plastered across his face. "A pity, sailing master," Stradling called over the waves, "to throw away your career on a mere whim." Selkirk, in a final surge of arrogant fury, shouted back, "You'll all sink before you reach port, Captain. I choose life." But as the longboat turned back toward the ship, and the Cinque Ports began to sail away, a terrifying realization slammed into Selkirk. He had been wrong. The captain hadn't begged. The crew hadn't mutinied. They had simply left him. He ran into the churning water, stumbling, arms outstretched, his powerful voice cracking with panic. "Wait, Captain. I changed my mind. Let me come back. I beg you." The captain never looked back. The ship, his last visible connection to the human race, became a speck, then a ghost, then nothing but the vast, silent blue. Alexander Selkirk stood knee-deep in the Pacific Ocean. He had demanded freedom from a sinking ship, and he had been given it, in the most brutal form imaginable. He was alone. No one knew he was here. He was surrounded by life, lush green mountains, wild goats, and the eternal mocking roar of the ocean, but he was disconnected from all humanity. The clock had just started on his solitude. The initial survival phase was pure animal instinct. Selkirk moved immediately to high ground, the lush, volcanic peaks of the island providing an immediate source of wood, fresh water from mountain streams, and better visibility. He understood the terrain. He had been here before for short shore leave. His first month was a blur of feverish activity fueled by fear. He built a crude, open shelter near the stream. He mastered his musket, shooting the wild goats, descendants of stock left by earlier sailors, for meat. The fat was rendered for oil to keep a lamp burning at night. But as the weeks blurred into months, the sheer weight of silence began to crush him. He developed a ritual. Every day he would climb the highest peak, the one that would later be named Selkirk's Lookout, and sit there, scanning the horizon for the white sail of a ship. Every evening he would climb down, the silence of the tropical twilight deepening around him. Every night the same realization: nothing. The first 18 months were the worst. The mind is a social creature. It needs conversation, debate, and human interaction to maintain its equilibrium. Selkirk began to lose his ability to speak. He would try to recite passages from the Bible, but the words felt strange and alien on his tongue, his voice a dry, rasping sound he barely recognized. He would talk to himself, but without correction or response, his thoughts began to spiral into dark, paranoid places. He suffered from crippling loneliness, a condition far more dangerous than starvation. He would often rush down to the beach, weeping, begging the inanimate ocean to return his sanity. Then one evening he saw the ultimate danger. 2 distant sails appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Selkirk's heart soared. He scrambled down the mountain, shouting until his throat bled. But as the ships came closer, he realized they weren't British. They were Spanish galleons. The island was in a Spanish zone. As an English privateer, if he were found, he wouldn't be rescued. He would be captured, tortured, and executed as a pirate. He had to hide from salvation. He extinguished his fire instantly, grabbed his musket, and scrambled back up the steepest, most overgrown section of the mountain. He hid himself in the dense foliage, watching in terror as the Spanish search parties landed on the beach, looking for any signs of an intruder. They spent hours on the island. Selkirk could hear their voices, their heavy boots on the rocks, the metallic clang of their weapons. It was the closest he had come to human contact, and it was a moment of pure dread. They finally left. Selkirk was safe, but the encounter taught him a terrible lesson. He could not trust any passing ship. He was marooned by choice, but he was isolated by war. The experience was a turning point. It forced him to confront the grim, undeniable truth. If he wanted to live, he had to accept that he was going to be here for a very, very long time. He stopped watching the sea. He turned his back on the blue horizon and looked inward, toward the green, living heart of the island. The time for panic was over. Now the time for reinvention had begun. Selkirk decided his biggest enemy was not the island, but the 18th century European man he still was. He was wasting energy, time, and materials trying to live like a civilized man. He moved his main camp inland, high up in the mountains, choosing a spot near two abundant freshwater streams. His focus shifted from survival to mastery. 1. Sustenance and tools. The wild goats were fast and agile. Selkirk's gunpowder was limited. He realized that a single bullet was a precious resource, a final card to play. He needed to hunt without it. He began to practice running barefoot. The harsh volcanic rock and sharp underbrush cut his feet at first, but slowly, painfully, his soles hardened. He became faster, quieter, and more agile. Eventually he could run down the wild goats. He discovered that when hunting, if he caught a goat kid, he would often only take its meat, but keep the female goat alive, letting her lead him to the herd's safe bedding areas. He had become a true hunter-gatherer, a predator who understood the value of conservation. He used the dried goatskins to replace his rapidly decaying European clothing, sewing them crudely together with leather thongs. His appearance changed drastically. He was long-haired, bearded, and dressed entirely in rough, stitched hide. 2. Domesticity and comfort. He built 2 durable huts from pimento wood. The wood was ideal, it smelled of spice and kept away the insects. One hut was for sleeping and prayer, his sanctuary. The second hut was his kitchen and workshop, his productive center. He used the natural rhythm of the goats and the island's unique resources. He ate the abundant cabbage palm hearts, which provided essential nutrients, and the spicy pepper berries, which helped to flavor the goat meat. Crucially, he domesticated some of the wild goats, keeping them penned for a steady supply of milk, which was essential for his health and sanity. He had created a small, functioning micro-society. 3. The battle for the soul. The biggest danger was the return of the madness, the creeping despair of having no one to share his success with. Selkirk turned to the only piece of civilization he had left, the Bible. He dedicated long hours to reading, chanting the scripture aloud, not for the comfort of the words, but for the discipline of using his voice. He would pace the ridges of the mountain, reading the passages again and again, forcing his mind to focus on the structure and rhythm of language. This discipline was the anchor that kept his sanity tethered. He later recounted that the sheer isolation forced him to find a deeper connection to nature and to his faith. The desperation of the first year gave way to a calm competence. The island was no longer a prison, it was a proving ground. By the end of his second year, Alexander Selkirk was no longer just a stranded sailor. He was the lord of the island, completely self-sufficient and thriving. But the island had one more cruel test waiting for him. Selkirk was at the peak of his physical prowess, a man honed by the wilderness. He could scale the sheer cliffs and chase down the goats with incredible speed. It was during one such chase that tragedy nearly struck. He was in hot pursuit of a goat, running at full speed along a narrow rocky ridge. He cornered the animal, but in a desperate move, the goat plunged over a sudden, concealed cliff face. Selkirk, unable to stop, followed it. He fell from a height that would have killed a less resilient man, landing hard on the sand below, with the heavy, dead goat on top of him. He was alive, but his leg was broken. The agony was blinding. He managed to crawl to his side, the pain shooting white-hot through his body. He was too far from his hut to signal. His musket lay broken several yards away. This was the ultimate test. Total helplessness in a world where help simply did not exist. He dragged himself under the shade of a large tree, and there he lay alone for the next 3 agonizing days. He had to set the brake himself, gritting his teeth, using rough strips of goatskin to tie a makeshift splint. The fear was no longer of loneliness, it was of failing to mend. A permanent disability meant the end of his hunting, the end of his milk supply, and the end of his life. He subsisted on the water he could reach and the sheer force of his will. The fight now was internal, a struggle between the pain and his determination to simply live. Slowly, agonizingly, the bone began to knit. For weeks, he was limited, forced to rely on his previously stored food and the kindness of the tame goats he had kept near the camp. This period was the crucible, the final burning away of the old Alex Selkirk. The episode of utter vulnerability taught him the deepest lesson of survival: humility. He emerged from his confinement a new man, physically scarred but spiritually invincible. He had faced death and won not with a weapon but with sheer endurance. He was now in his 4th year of solitude. He had fully integrated into the island's ecosystem. He was quiet, alert, and his mind was sharper than ever. He was no longer miserable. He was content. The date was February 1, 1709. Selkirk, dressed in his full goatskin attire, was finishing a meal of roasted goat and wild vegetables when he heard a sound he hadn't heard in 4 years and 4 months: the dull thud of a cannon. He climbed to his lookout. 2 ships, large British privateering vessels, were sailing toward the island. He had faced Spanish ships before and hidden. But this time something was different. He saw the British flag clearly. He scrambled down the mountain, knowing he had to light a massive fire, the signal that would confirm his desperate existence. He piled up dried pimento wood, which burns brightly and releases a fragrant, noticeable smoke. The British ships, the Duke and the Duchess, saw the smoke and sent a longboat ashore. Selkirk waited by the beach, his heart pounding a frantic drum against his ribs. When the longboat landed, the officers stared at him, bewildered. Before them stood a wild man, clad entirely in leather, with a flowing beard and the eyes of a creature of the forest. He looked more like a deity of the mountain than a human being. The officer in charge, Captain Woods Rogers, stepped forward. "Who are you?" Rogers asked, his voice ringing with disbelief. Selkirk opened his mouth to reply, and the first shock of his rescue hit him. His voice was a garbled, guttural sound. He had almost forgotten how to speak. His tongue felt thick and foreign. He had to force the words, slow and halting, out of his throat. I am Alexander Selkirk, Scottish, sailing master of the Cinque Ports." Rogers and his crew were stunned. They knew the story, the reckless sailing master who had been left behind. But they expected a corpse or a raving lunatic. They did not expect this figure of rugged, vibrant health. They took him back to the ship, offering him a feast of boiled meat, bread, and wine. But Selkirk, the man who had starved and prayed for this moment, found he could not stomach the rich food. His stomach, adjusted to the clean, lean diet of goat and wild plants, immediately rejected it. He could only drink the fresh water. He was a foreigner in the world of men. His most profound struggle came next, reacclimatizing to the human crew. Their chatter was loud, their movements clumsy, and their food was greasy and overwhelming. The smells and sounds of the ship, the creaking, the shouting, the constant motion, were an assault on the hypersensitized awareness he had gained on the silent mountain. He had mastered the island, but he had to relearn how to master humanity. He sailed home with Woods Rogers, eventually returning to England in 1711. Selkirk was famous overnight. The man who had been dead was now a living legend, the ultimate survivor. He was interviewed, sensationalized, and his story became the subject of countless pamphlets. But the world he returned to was too small for him. He inherited a small sum of money, but he was restless, haunted by the memory of the island. He found the pettiness, the ambition, and the constant noise of European society unbearable. "I was a better man on the island, free from the vices and follies of mankind," he is famously quoted as saying. His story was eventually documented by journalists and sailors, including Richard Steele and Woods Rogers, and it provided the direct, undeniable blueprint for Daniel Defoe's 1719 novel Robinson Crusoe, the single most influential piece of survival fiction ever written. The story of Alexander Selkirk reminds us that survival is not just about finding food and fire. It is about the interior architecture of the soul. The island broke him down to his essential self. It stripped away his arrogance, his dependency, and his fear of isolation. It taught him the value of discipline, humility, and the preciousness of human language. He left the island as a castaway, but he returned as the master of his own world. He found that while he had spent over 4 years alone, he was never truly lonely, because he had learned to live in complete harmony with the only thing he could trust, himself. If this story proved to you that the greatest tool for survival is not a knife or a gun, but the capacity for change, then subscribe and share this with someone who needs to be reminded of the true power of human resilience. We are all capable of building a kingdom in the wilderness. Sometimes you just need to be left alone to find out how.